I'm honored to be asked to come back. This is my second visit to this camp, and I've always been treated well. I always enjoy coming back. It also speaks very well of each of you that you would take time out of your evening to come here and share our history with us. I am honored that you would do so and come to listen to me. Now, I was told to use whatever subject I wanted to talk to you about. And I do have a subject to talk to you about that has to do with my life. But I'm going to add another one. You're going to get two. Because yesterday was February 22nd. In my time, February 22nd was one of two major, most important holidays in the United States. Well, yesterday was George Washington's birthday. The other important holiday was July 4th, which was the Declaration of Independence. Now, it does surprise some people to find out that when General, they always called him General, even though he was president, General Washington, when he passed away, it was a spontaneous reaction throughout the nation to honor him on February 22nd. It was later that the government got involved, but the government recognized that this is an important holiday. So yesterday, in honor of General Washington, briefly I'm going to tell you the Lee connection to General Washington. Now, before the Revolutionary War, the Lees and the Washingtons were very well acquainted. They knew each family. During the lead up to the Revolution, when the different colonies were determining what they were going to do, the Lees were involved. Two of my father's brothers were involved. General Washington, at that time Colonel Washington, was involved. And two of my ancestors, two of my uncles, were involved in the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention, and then the Washington government. So we're very well acquainted with General Washington, but what else is the connection? My father was Henry Lee. He was one of the Lees that was a man of action. He was an expert horseman, and during the war, the Revolutionary War, he was a cavalry commander. And that's where he got his nickname, White Horse Harry Lee. In European terms, military terms, there were two types of horsemen: heavy cavalry and light cavalry. The heavy cavalry carried the heavy equipment, the big strong horses, and they were to strike the enemy at the right moment and break their lines. The light horse moved fast, struck hard, kept on moving. And my father was a master at it. And General Washington relied on him. They were good friends. After the war, my father was governor of Virginia twice. He was selected by the Virginia delegation at the funeral for General Washington to give the Virginia eulogy. And you may recognize the one part that everybody quotes is he said, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." Now you can imagine me as a young child growing up in Alexandria, Virginia, straight across the river from the new capital, Washington City. My father, my mother, everyone revered General Washington's memory. There were so many people in the family and friends and relatives that had known General Washington, had worked in the government. So as I'm growing up, I'm being shown that General Washington is the person that you would want to emulate. I also met a couple every Sunday at church, Mr. and Mrs. George Washington Parke Custis. Mr. Custis was the grandson of Martha Washington. He was the step-grandson of George Washington and also the adopted son of George Washington. He grew up as the son of George Washington. After he moved on and became of age, and General Washington passed on, he built a fabulous house on top of Arlington Heights, called it Arlington, looked over the river at Washington City, and he considered himself the keeper of the memory of General Washington. He had all the memorabilia, he had all of the things that General Washington used during the war, had many of his papers and documents, had his swords, his uniforms, his tents. And February 22nd, every year he put on a large gala on the property and the lawns of Arlington. And would set up the tents and set up all that memorabilia and tell people, give them talks on how it was to grow up with General Washington. He also did the same thing on July 4th, but the big event for him was February 22nd. Now, the Custuses had one child, a daughter, slightly younger than I. We met very young at church. Her name was Mary Anna Randolph Custis. So she was the great-granddaughter of Martha and George Washington. Now, as some young gentlemen and some young ladies do, over time we fell in love. And so in 1831, after I graduated from the military academy and became an engineer, we were wed. Our first son was named George Washington Parke Custis Lee. And he carried on the tradition of the Washington and the Lees. And living in Arlington at the mansion, in the wintertime, they would pull out boxes of letters from General Washington when we were snowed in and read the letters and even understand more about General Washington. And that is the connection with the Lee family to the Washington family. Unfortunately, when the war came, Arlington and that property were confiscated by the government. Now, confiscated is the word I use. My wife uses a harsher term, as in theft. All of the memorabilia that was at Arlington at the beginning of the war was all confiscated. In my lifetime, it never was returned by the government. And that is primarily the connection. We continued, my sons, my daughters continued the legacy of the connection between the Lee family and the Washington family. And we always honor his birthday on February 22nd, as should you. Now, for the topic that I came here to actually talk to you about, although I hope you did learn something about our connection with Washington, I'm going to talk to you about my experience with the state of Florida. Because everyone thinks about all the great battles I was in, what I did in the Mexican War, the things that happened in the 1860s. But I did have some connections with Florida, some experience with Florida. My first experience with Florida could have changed history just a little bit. In 1846, the United States was becoming involved in a war with the government of Mexico. I was working on fortifications in the harbor of New York. In the fall of 1846, I received orders to board a ship and report to General Wool and take part in this war, which I did. The ship was loaded with supplies and Army officers heading to the front. The ship went down the coast, ran into a tropical storm around Cape Hatteras, managed to miss it, most of it, but in the Florida Straits, now of course I've seen Florida all the way down off the ship, on the ship, but in the Florida Straits we were struck by a tremendous storm, and as I wrote my wife later, we were bounced around like apples in a barrel, and the ship almost went down. Fortunately, the ship was powered by a steam engine instead of relying on sail, so it did manage not to go down. I've always wondered, well, what would have happened if it had gone down? That was my first experience. Fortunately, we survived, although I will have to tell you, everyone on the ship, including me, were seasick. And it took a while to get our land legs back after we finally made land. I went on to the Mexican War and returned, and I was sent to Baltimore to work in the harbor of Baltimore on Lake Fort Carroll. In 1848, I received orders from the commander, the officer in charge of the Corps of Engineers, to report to Mobile, Alabama, to meet with a Board of Engineers, which I was a member of. The Board of Engineers were sent to different places to inspect things and give reports on what should be done to this fort or this facility. We were told we were going to make a survey or an inspection of the coast of Florida from Pensacola Harbor all the way around to Amelia Island. And because it was so long ago, I can't remember the name of the title of this detail, so I'm going to read it to you. In case you ever want to look it up, report for the Board of Engineers upon their examination of the west and east coast of Florida from Pensacola Harbor to Amelia Island. The government always has to complicate things, you know. At Mobile, Alabama, we assembled the officers for the board and proceeded to Pensacola Harbor, which was an easy part because a lot of the information was already available. We had a number of things we were supposed to accomplish. Number one, and the first one, is this. Every island, every isle on the Florida coast from Pensacola to Amelia belonged to the United States government. They did not belong to the new state of Florida. Well, of course, the state of Florida wanted some of these because then they would sell them and have funds for their government. People had already gone onto these islands and isles and basically just set up housekeeping. Our job was to determine which ones were militarily important that the government should keep, and all the rest we would let the state of Florida have. That was number one. Number two was to investigate every river, every harbor, every estuary, and determine what's coming in and out of those harbors as far as product, how important were they, and whether or not they should be fortified to be protected. We were still thinking the British might come back, so we didn't want any people moving in on our territory, and that's why we had this big program for decades on building forts, was to protect the harbors. The other purpose was to determine where should lighthouses be. Where are good places to locate lighthouses to benefit commerce and also to benefit the Navy. So we had quite a few things we had to do. We boarded a ship called the Phoenix and started out, moved our way down the coast, stopped at Cedar Key. At that time, if I recall correctly, Cedar Key was exporting 2,500 barrels of bales of cotton and approximately 2,800 bales of skins and pellets per year coming out of Cedar Key going to market. We came down to Tampa Bay. Now this was important. This is in January and February of 1849 when we finally got underway. We stopped at Tampa Bay, and there was a number of important reasons. One of them, of course, Fort Brooke's there. But something happened in October of 1848 on Tampa Bay and on the coast here. And would anybody want to know what that is? Anybody know what happened? It was the Great Gale of 48. Now, some people call those hurricanes, but in my time, it was a gale. And it came up in the Gulf and came directly into Tampa Bay, bringing a lot of water with it, sucked all the water out of Manatee River, brought it all into the harbor, and struck Fort Brooke in the village of Tampa. What you would call downtown Fort Brooke was under 15 feet of water. Most of the people went to what they call Tampa Heights, which was the high ground. In the middle of Fort Brooke was a very large Indian mound, and many people went to the top of the Indian mound and hung onto the trees. Out at Egmont Key, they had just completed a lighthouse, brand new. The lighthouse keeper tied a boat to a tree, and his family and he rode the storm out on that boat. They told me when the storm was over, he rode the boat into Tampa, unloaded his family, said, "I quit," and left. I can't say that I blame him. But we had a very important job to do, was to see what was left of Fort Brooke and what to do about it. In the 1830s and the early 1840s, Fort Brooke was the major military installation for the United States government. Almost the entire U.S. Army at one point during the war with the Seminoles went through Fort Brooke. All the major commanders, all the general officers were at Fort Brooke. The Marine Commandant was at Fort Brooke. The entire Marine Corps went through Fort Brooke. So in the 30s and the 40s, up until the Mexican War, this was the most active and busiest fortification the U.S. government had. After the Mexican War and the Seminoles were no longer seen to be a threat, our job was to see not only what we were doing officially, finding out what was coming in out of Tampa Bay, what was important, what wasn't, was to decide, what do we do with Fort Brooke? Do we rebuild it? What's the damage? The damage was extensive. All the docks and wharfs and warehouses were gone. Apparently, when the water receded, it just took a lot of Fort Brooke with it. Fortunately, believe it or not, there were no casualties. For myself, personally, Captain John Casey was stationed at Fort Brooke. John Casey graduated with me in 1829 at the West Point, at the military academy. He was a friend. I was anxious to see him because during the Mexican War, he became ill and had to be relieved and requested to be sent back to Fort Brooke because that's where he had been for several years. He felt the weather would help him out. He was suffering from consumption, which I understand some people call tuberculosis. And I was anxious to see him at least one more time. I got to spend time with John Casey. He provided us with detailed, actually incredibly detailed maps of the coast of Florida, the west coast of Florida, from north of Tampa down past Fort Myers. These maps were so accurate that he created himself. They were so accurate that when the government made new maps in 1855, they took his and copied them and just updated a few names. In an area of Sarasota Bay, there is a Casey Isle and a Casey Inlet that were named in honor of him. I'm sad to say at Fort Brooke in 1855 he passed away from his illness. But he was a good friend and I was pleased to see him. We proceeded down the coast, stopping at all these different places, making a record of how important they were or how unimportant they were, what do we keep, what we don't. We finally arrived at Amelia Island in Fernandina. At that time, a fort which was going to be named Fort Clinch was essentially coming out of the ground. You have to understand, I'm sure you all appreciate it, working in Florida, especially in those days, was not a 12-month affair. In summertime, you quit working because the work crew begins to get sick, and that's the sickness time. So a lot of these works, like Fort Clinch and Fort Jackson and a number of forts, they didn't go up as quick as you would imagine. But Fort Clinch was on the way of being built. From there, I went across to the Sound to Cumberland Island to visit my father's grave, White Horse Harry Lee's grave. It was the first time I've had an opportunity to be there, and I definitely wanted to see his grave. It was well kept. It was a very moving experience. From there, we went to Savannah, and I had been selected as the secretary of this board of engineers and submitted a 38-page report on all of the things we had seen and done. We said in this report that Egmont Key, Mullet Key, and Tampa Bay needed to be fortified. St. George Island, of course, Pensacola was already fortified. Those were priorities. Second priority was Cedar Key, a number of other isles down to what we call Fort Dallas. Somebody tells me they call it Miami nowadays, but we called it Fort Dallas. And we marked wherever we should have lighthouses, like the one that was brand new and gone at Egg Mine Key. From there, I went to Baltimore to work on Fort Carroll. I should tell you, in 1855, the government finally came up with money for these lighthouses. And they sent an officer down to supervise the construction, the design and construction of all these lighthouses. And you may recognize his name. He was a friend of my family, a friend of mine, George Gordon Meade. Some of you recognize his name?
Basic training.
He also, while he was here, became involved in what they call the Third Seminole War in the 1850s. And a town called Fort Meade, yes, it's named after George Gordon Meade. Now, I've gone back to Baltimore. I'm back doing engineer work on fortifications. My son, George Washington Park Custis, remember I mentioned him? He graduated first in his class out of West Point in 1853, became an engineer. Where do you suppose he went for one of his first postings? No place but Amelia Island and Fort Clinch, and spent 3 years there. So even though I was not in Florida at that time, I'm receiving letters from my son telling me all the things that are going on in Fort Clinch, including the fact, which surprised me, they were working 12 months out of the year. And he says that he describes the summers as brutal and horrible, but they still continue to work there. So now, 1861, here comes the war. Unfortunately, even though we thought politicians would take care of that, it didn't happen. Here's the war. In late 61, I was sent by President Jefferson Davis to go to the coast of, the East Coast and become commander of the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Now, one of my jobs was to do what I had done in Florida, which was to inspect all these fortifications and determine what's most important and what isn't. Now, of course, the politicians in Richmond wanted us to defend the entire coast. Well, if you have 100 places to defend and you have 100 men, how do you do that? You can't do it. So you decide this is the most important, and most of my ordnance, my artillery, and my gunners are going to go to these places. And some of these places, even though we would like to protect everything, are going to have to be left. In the late fall, November of 61, I went down the coast and visited Amelia Island. And it was an unfinished fort. Most of the artillery were in what we call sand batteries out on the beaches, with all this sand built up to protect the guns. Fort Clinch does not look like what it did when the Union Army was finished with it, because they continued construction during the war. So it was not a very good protection for the harbor, and I wrote that I would hope that the enemy will wait long enough for us to be ready for them there, which of course was not going to happen. So I was in Florida in November of 61, long enough to visit Fernandina, Jacksonville, and Amelia Island. I took that opportunity once again to go across to Cumberland Island to visit my father's grave. I came back in January, back to Amelia Island, to give the hard orders that Amelia Island, Fernandina, was going to be evacuated. All the artillery that had not been mounted was just laying on the sand. All the artillery on the coast was going to be taken to other places that were more important, like Wilmington, Savannah, Charleston, all these places where you had deep harbors where ships could come in. I was not a popular person in Florida when I left. From there, I was recalled to Richmond, and of course, you know that part of the story where I went to the Army in Northern Virginia. That was the last time I was in Florida until 1870. By this time, I've become president of Washington College. My health is failing. I've gone to multiple doctors. They've all thumped me over like an old boiler ready to be condemned. And all of them have an opinion on what was wrong. The one that they most agreed on was there was a problem with the heart sac, this part, which was probably true because I had pain in my chest and gradually my energy was being drained. I couldn't last as long during the day as I normally could. I walked slower, my arms hurt. I was basically failing. I went to the college board of directors and said that I'm probably going to have to resign. And they said, no, you can't do that. Take a vacation. Go somewhere and rest. So we said, okay. So I'm going to travel to the south, down to the south to Florida. And my daughter Agnes is going to attend me, and we're going to go on a quiet trip down to Florida, which of course didn't happen because the trip meant that anywhere I went on train, stage, or ship, there were thousands of people waiting for me to be able to say they saw Robert E. Lee, which was an honor, but that's not what the trip was for. On the train, there would be people all along the rail tracks just watching the train go by so they could say that they saw the train that Robert E. Lee was in. In Savannah, I did get to stop and see my old friend Joseph Johnston. We had dinner together. On these stops, usually at the train stations, there were thousands of people, bands, politicians, all my old veterans that I couldn't turn my back on, of course, all wanting to see me, all wanting to give me dinner, all wanting to give me speeches. So you can imagine how much rest I was getting. They finally made it down by ship to Jacksonville. At Jacksonville, so many people crowded onto the ship before I could leave the ship, and they're all on one side of the ship. So the ship's doing this. So the captain says, you've got to do something because these people are going to sink my ship. So I walked out on the railing and tried to kind of get everybody to start leaving the ship. And I stood on the railing, and here's thousands of my old veterans, and I take off my hat, and they take off their hats, and my daughter wrote that there was dead silence. There was not a sound other than the waves lapping on the side of the boat. Thousands of people, their hats off, not one word. From there, we went up to St. John's to a place called Orange Mill. Colonel James Cole's home. It was near Palatka. Now, I've been told, oh yes, you went to Palatka. No, I didn't. I never saw Palatka because Colonel Cole's home was before you got there. And he was right on the river, and he had a dock, and he had all thousands of acres of oranges, and they would load the ships right there and leave. So it was, for me, it was perfect. The only people on the dock was Colonel Cole and his family, and actually nobody knew we were there, really, to be honest. And so we had a very relaxing visit. I got to eat oranges right off the tree. My daughter enjoyed it. There was beautiful flowers. It was, as you all well know, there are times Florida is beautiful. And this was one of those times. It's springtime in 1870. From there we came back to Lexington. The trip, although it was honorable, we stopped in North Carolina to see my dear daughter Annie, her grave. So I got to see my father and my daughter. They passed away during the war. But as far as being restful, it wasn't. In October of 1870 is when I went to see the Lord. And I was ready. Thank you very much.